first, let's get to our reporters. NBC's Henry Gomez, he is covering the ins and outs of the Republican primary. NBC's Mike Memoli is our point person on the Biden political operation. Mike, we'll get to you in a moment. Henry, to you first, just a few days removed now from that indictment. Have Trump's fellow candidates settled on what their new normal, what their strategy is going to be at this point?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag at the moment, Peter. You've got two extremes. Like on one side, you've got a candidate like Vivek Ramaswamy, who's a political unknown, who has basically made a central piece of his campaign a pledge to pardon Donald Trump if he somehow becomes president. And then on the other end, you've got these anti-Trump scolds like Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson, whom you just mentioned, who have been openly critical of Trump to begin with and are using this latest indictment as another opportunity to hit him for all of his perceived flaws. Now, in the middle, this sort of mushy middle, you have a bunch of other candidates like former Vice President Mike Pence, like Nikki Haley, who are sort of trying a two-fisted attack here where on one hand, they'll question the Department of Justice's investigation as being politically motivated. And on the other, they'll acknowledge that there are some concerns about how former President Trump behaved and handled documents. And you've got, as you mentioned, Governor Ron DeSantis, who is kind of ignoring it altogether, just saying that this is problematic as an investigation. I think what this shows you is that they haven't latched on to a coherent strategy to take this fight to Trump. No one's really sure what the right mix or balance is, because to win the Republican nomination, you have to win over voters who supported Donald Trump. And so if you're going to make the issue of his indictment a central issue in the campaign, you have to do so in a way that doesn't alienate those supporters.
It's such a delicate dance these guys are trying to walk, these men and women are trying to walk at this point. I want to talk about the RNC pledge. This, of course, was a flashpoint. You'll remember in 2016 when it was meant to keep Donald Trump from running as a third-party candidate. It's a flashpoint now as some Republicans are wavering on whether they would support him. What is the situation on that at this moment?
Well, those two anti-Trump scolds that I just mentioned, Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson, just listen to how they're talking. If Donald Trump is the nominee, they're not going to support him. They're not going to vote for him, at least based on what they've been saying on the campaign trail already. And if you're saying this now, but also angling to be on the debate stage, which both of these candidates are, it comes down to whether this is some sort of a wink and a nod. Now, remember, Donald Trump also disavowed this pledge back in 2016. He initially signed the pledge, but then back I think it was in March of 2016 when it was down to him, Ted Cruz, and John Kasich. He walked away from it, saying he wasn't necessarily going to honor that pledge anymore. So these candidates are treating it as a non-binding document, which essentially it is. What's going to happen if Donald Trump's the nominee and they're on that debate stage? They're not going to. Nobody's going to really pay attention to if they go back on their words at that point. But an RNC official told our colleague Ben Kamasar for a story today that if the candidates are questioning or complaining about this debate pledge now, they should probably reconsider their status in the race.
So, ma'am, let me ask you about what they're thinking on the Dem side here. The White House, obviously, mum about the indictment. President Biden hasn't said anything since we got our look at it. Some Democrats are itching to get the party to go on offense, though. What can you tell us about this tension here, the fear that President Trump, former President Trump, could sort of discredit all of this just by being the one who is the one talking right now?
Yeah, Peter, if not for you and the question you were able to ask the president last week, we wouldn't have heard anything from the president on this situation really in the last few weeks. And listen, Democrats, these Biden allies, they're saying we understand why President Biden, ever the institutionalist, someone who has run on and tried to stick with this norms and traditions argument that he wants to respect the independence of the Justice Department. They're understanding his point of view here, but they're saying this is bordering on malpractice at a certain point to let former President Trump and other Republicans continue to make this argument about unfounded that the president is weaponizing the Justice Department against his enemies go unanswered. They think he needs to be more fulsome, not necessarily in speaking about Trump's situation legally here, but to simply defend the institutions themselves. Now, it is interesting, one of the suggestions that they made, which is to say, look, former Vice President Pence was investigated and cleared. So this is not about weaponization. This is about simply following the facts where they lead them. Now, the White House is not unusual, not unaccustomed to this kind of internal friendly advice from fellow Democrats. In fact, I think Dan Pfeiffer was one of those who coined the term bedwetting in 2012 when Mitt Romney was closing in on President Obama in the polls in that year. But they really speak to what they think is the political reality they're facing, which is that it's the swing voters who are less engaged in this story, who really don't want to hear anybody talking about these legal issues. And the president doesn't want to get sucked in, have his messaging defined by this. It's also really interesting, Peter, to look at the other ways in which Democrats are running different strategies at this moment. You look at the DCCC, which is trying to re-elect, bring back a Democratic majority in the House, and to do so by winning these battleground districts that were won by President Biden but are now seated by Republican incumbents in those seats. They're running aggressively on tying these Republican lawmakers to President Trump because that's the way they see flipping the House. But the DSCC, which wants to maintain the Senate majority, has a bunch of races in deeply red states like Montana, like West Virginia. They're laying off the situation completely. So it really does speak to the way you don't want to antagonize a base here against you politically, and that's what the president's doing, and that's what these other campaigns are trying to do.
All of it as President Biden prepares to enjoy some union endorsements tomorrow as he begins sort of the political campaigning a bit tomorrow in, of course, the great state of Pennsylvania. Mike Memoli with the very latest Mem. Thank you very much. Henry, thank you as well.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.